Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. Welcome to everyone joining us online. Tonight we continue on with our series, A Journey to Faith. We are on lesson 89, and as you can see by this angry pointing face here, we're talking about the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, we're talking about the new ruling class of Judea. So last week we introduced the Sadducees and the Pharisees and spent a lot of time talking about who they were, where they came from, and what the differences in beliefs were. The last ruler that we finished with last week, John Hyrcanus, he was actually a Sadducee, and so there's an alignment politically between the leaders versus the common people who are more aligned with the Pharisees. So before we get into it, we'll just put up this introductory information and have a talk about where we're up to. So we're following the genealogy of Jesus. From Matthew chapter 1, verses 12 to 17, deals with all of the descendants after the exile to Babylon. And we're currently up to Jacob, who is the grandfather of Jesus. And so the pathway for this book, this 2,000-year journey, is all connected to the genealogy of Jesus. Now, during the life of Jacob, highlighted here in this lime green colour, we have a change of 4 different rulers in independent Judea. And so last week we ran up to John Hyrcanus, who passed away at the end, and we're introducing Aristobulus today. And there's going to be 3 changes of leadership during tonight's lesson, and obviously during the life of Jacob himself. Now Jacob, as I mentioned, we estimated that he was born in 126 BC, and that he passes away in 67 BC, which is the date that we finish following him tonight. So the history side of it, we run up to 67 BC as well. And of course, Jacob's son is Joseph, and the son of Joseph and Mary, of course, is Jesus. So this was a picture of John Hyrcanus from the previous week. Just pop this up to give you some recall on who he is. He's the third son of Simon, and Simon is the son of the original Maccabee who was called Mattathias. So we're on the 3rd generation with him. This week we move into the 4th generation of leaders. And this was the last map that we had a look at, which shows you the region of growth. So under John Hyrcanus, all of these pink areas here, they are all the new territory which was conquered while he was ruling. And so we see a massive growth of the Hasmonean Kingdom of Judea, as it's called. And then tonight we're going to move on from John Hyrcanus, and we're going to be looking at Judas Aristobulus first, who's his son, and then following him we're going to go to Alexander Jannaeus, who's also another one of his sons. Judas is the first ruler of the Hebrew Hasmonean dynasty to wear the diadem. And so what does that mean? What's the diadem? You remember? Right? It's not a hat, it's a cord, if you will, or a piece of linen, and it wraps around the forehead, and it has 2 tassels down the back. And so that's why it's called dia for 2. So diadem. And it represents their authority to rule as a king. And so what this is saying is that this headband with the 2 tassels that he wore was a symbol of his sovereignty. And so he is the first person to declare himself a king of Judea in 481 years. And so this is pretty extraordinary, because if we read our Bibles, it says that only the descendants from the house of David, from the tribe of Judah, are permitted to be kings. So what we find here is that Judas is descended from the house of Hasmon, from the tribe of Simeon. And so this is where the name the Hasmonean Kingdom comes from, because they're from a house called the House of Hashmon, Hashmon. So that's where that word comes from. And he disregards this bloodline descendancy to not only declare himself king, but also to retain the additional office of high priest. Now you might remember his father realised in the previous generation that can't go on anymore because the people aren't happy about it. And so he actually said that his wife was to govern from a civil authority basis and that his son would be the high priest. But do you remember what he did to his mother? What did he do?
Starved her.
No, he starved her, that's right. He put her in prison and starved her to death and then took over both roles for himself. And so this sets the tone for the sort of character that this person is. Now, like his father, he's also a Sadducee, and as a fourth generation Hasmonean ruler, he aligns himself with aristocratic Hellenic Jews who influence his decisions to such a degree that he diminishes the identity of the vast majority of traditional Jews. So the traditional Jews are aligned with the, do you remember? They're aligned with the Pharisees, and the Hellenic Jews are aligned with the Sadducees. So the Hellenic Jews are those who accepted the Hellenic rule, so the Seleucids before them and the Ptolemies, and the traditional Jews are the ones who rejected them. And so we see this division between the two. Now, evidence can be found for this in the New Testament when it says that the Jewish court is called the Assembly of the Jews, the Council of the Jews, or the Council of the Elders. So if you look at Luke chapter 22, verse 66, it reads, "At daybreak the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law." And so we find there that we're describing, if they're chief priests and teachers of the law, who are we describing? Who are the teachers of the law and the chief priests? Sadducees. Okay. So remember, we defined, that's another lesson from last week, we defined that the Sadducees were all priests. And they were the ones who basically controlled the temple. And so the Pharisees were also priests, but they were also common people as well. So in that first scripture from Luke 22, verse 66, it says, "At daybreak the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law." But when we go to Matthew 26, verse 59, and Mark 14, verse 55, they both say exactly the same thing. The Jewish court is given the Greek name, which is, we spoke about this last week, what's the Greek name for them? You all remember? The Sanhedrin. Right. Now that's a Greek word. Right? And so we find in both of those scriptures it says the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, it says in the Bible. And so we actually see a different use of the same meaning, one in Greek, one in a pure translation from Greek into English. So in other words, it's not representative of the Greek name or the Hellenic aspect of them. We've got one version. So this says something about the authors of the books, because in Luke he mentions them as the assembly or the council, whereas in the other books they're mentioned as the Sanhedrin. If we go to Acts 23 verse 6, it actually says, "Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin." So once again we see that influence of the Greek people. So when we have a look at this, if the New Testament is translated in whichever Bible you have from its original language into English, if the words were used the same way, they would be translated the same way, right? But if in some books you have the word Sanhedrin and in another book you have the word council, then you see that the parent word that was used originally must have been different. Okay? And so we just notice these sort of subtleties in the Bible itself. But that's the influence of Hellenism. So as a ruler, Aristobulus is suspicious and jealous. And his wife, Queen Shalomit, or Salome, Alexandra, is the same. Aristobulus is struck with disease, so his wife takes the decision to kill his brother Antigonus. Now this goes back to a previous lesson, so I'll read and you'll get what's actually going on. So his wife takes the decision to kill his brother Antigonus, not just because he's next in line to ascend the throne, but because Antigonus had helped Aristobulus to kill his own mother. And so he sees the behaviour of him, and she decides, I better get in first because I'll be next if I don't. And so what does she do? The queen believes if her husband dies, she's next. So to bring this to fruition and yet appear to have no accountability for what she plans, the queen sows mistrust in the mind of the king by suggesting his brother Antigonus is going to take his throne by force. She then turns to her brother-in-law and persuades him that Aristobulus is interested in seeing some new armour he has. You can't believe this is a true story, can you? Knowing full well that he will arrive kitted in his armour and weapons, she tells Aristobulus his brother is coming to kill him. So she's completely set them up. So let's just say that Antigonus never makes it to the throne, and just a few days later in 103 BC, Aristobulus dies of internal bleeding from the disease he has, and we find that both brothers are now out of the picture. So within 1 year, the queen's father-in-law, mother-in-law, husband and brother-in-law have all died. So she decides to release the former king's 3 younger brothers from prison and places Alexander Jannaeus on the throne of Judea. So when John Hyrcanus passed away, he had 3 sons. Well, he had 5 sons in total, but he put 3 of them into jail with his wife. His wife was starved to death, but the 3 sons were obviously still alive. And so at this point in time, she takes the 3 sons back out of prison, and one of them is installed on the throne. So released from prison and installed on the throne of the independent Hasmonean Kingdom of Judea, Alexander Jannaeus then marries his brother's widow, Salome Alexandra, in accordance with the law of Yibum, which is a levirate marriage. Who knows what that means? We've talked about this before. I haven't used the Hebrew word before, Yibum, Y-I-B-B-U-M, but it's a levirate marriage. What happens if a brother passes away? What happens to their wife? They marry them, and what happens if they have a child?
The child belongs to the previous husband. Right,
the child belongs to the previous husband in terms of inheritance, and if there's any more children, they actually just become normal children of both of them. And so this is done because it's there to make sure that the inheritance that the Lord gave them when they first entered the promised land is bequeathed to the next generation and the next and the next, no matter what happens. It's kind of a nice thing too, isn't it, in the sense that, you know, a wife doesn't truly become a widow and is cast out on her own. The laws are very different today, but in the past, if you were on your own, you would have been out. No way of earning a living, nowhere to live, and so you'd be destitute and probably have a very short life. And so the Lord set up this in order to take care of the women and make sure that if they lost a partner, that there was someone to take care of them. What's another example of this? 2 strong examples in the Bible, one in the Old Testament, one in the New.
Jesus.
Yeah. So Joseph married Mary, she was already with child as he thought, and so that was the same. What about the Old Testament?
Ruth.
Right, the story of Boaz and Ruth is another one. So they call them kinsman redeemers. So they're kin, they're men, and they redeem their inheritance by marrying the lady who is either lost a husband, or there's a child who doesn't have someone that's for them, that's in the family. Okay. And this fellow, Alexander Jannaeus, he also openly sides with the Sadducees and he adopts their rights in the temple. Unlike the short rule of his sick older brother, Alexander Jannaeus constantly involves himself in military conflict. His regional neighbours are tied up in their own conflicts, so he has the space to pursue his own conquest. So we mentioned this before, the Seleucid Empire has imploded, they've got 2 small kingdoms to the north, they have no power anymore, the Egyptians aren't particularly interested in them, and so they have this vacuum at this point in time politically, and so he decides he's going to go about his business and take back all of the territory that was originally given to them by the Lord in the boundaries of the promised land. So the 3 most immediate threats to the security of Judea is the king of the south, which is from the book of Daniel, chapter 11. Who's the king of the south? What's that represent?
Egypt.
Who's south? Egypt. Right. So they have the king of the south, Egypt, they have the fourth beast from the west. Who's that? The fourth beast from the west. Again in the book of Daniel, with the prophecies. Sorry?
It's one of the generals.
One of the generals. It's a
Alexander the Great.
empire, no. Alexander the Great is not the fourth beast. No. Alexander the Great in Greek is the same. It's the same beast. There was 4 prophesied beasts. All right. There was the Babylonians, followed by the Persians, followed by the Greeks. That's 3. So the 4th is the Romans. The Romans are a rising power, and so they're to their west. And then, of course, they've got the king of the north, which are the Sadducees, who have just recently imploded. So they're there, but they don't pose too much of a threat. But these threats never materialise because the Romans are battling civil wars, the Sadducees are too weak, and the Egyptians give their support to Alexander Jannaeus under the rule of Cleopatra III. So they have somebody that they're aligned with. So with no external threat, Alexander Jannaeus assembles a mercenary army. I'm sorry, I'll just pop up this picture first. This is a relief, as they're called, a stone carving of Cleopatra III in a temple called Kom Ombo in Egypt. And this is a coin of Ptolemy IX, and he's actually the son of Cleopatra III, who we'll introduce shortly. So these are both images that represent real people, and so once again we know that the Bible is grounded in truth. So with no external threat, Alexander Jannaeus assembles a mercenary army to successfully conquer the territories of West Samaria and the entire coastal plain of Ascalon. And so I'll put up another picture, and this tells a story. So the last map that I showed you was both in the pink and in the green. Now we're in the next ruler. All those areas are now highlighted in green. And so in these areas that we see here that are highlighted in the pink now, these are the new territories which are going to be expanded underneath the leadership of Alexander Jannaeus. And so we see, if you think about the promised land, we see that they've pretty much got it all back, excepting they've actually got some extra on this side because this isn't part of the promised land. Right? So we'll explain our way through what you're looking at on the map there. So they conquered the territories of West Samaria and the entire coastal plain except Ascalon, and this includes the coastal ports of Dor, Rapha and Antidon. And so here is Dor, up in the northern part of Israel, and down here we have Rapha and Antidon, which are next to Gaza over here. So they're all these coastal locations that they conquer. In 96 BC, they outlast the inhabitants of Gaza in a year-long siege and gain control over the Nabatean trade routes to the Mediterranean Sea in the south. And in 81 BC, this territorial expansion reaches its peak when territory in the northern Transjordan, known as Golan Heights in today's Israel, is captured. So first of all, terminology. Transjordan means it's on the other side of the Jordan River. So all of this region here is called the Transjordan. This area up the top here is the northern Transjordan, and it is actually what's part of Golan Heights today. So when we talk about the claim of Israel today for the ancient lands and the dispute that was over Golan Heights, they actually had it a long, long time ago. Okay, and again, if you go back to the original land that was given to them by the Lord, if you might recall, it actually says that they had the land across to the Euphrates River. And so this was part of the promised land. It's not new territory that they're taking, but it had a new name at this point in time. Okay, so whilst there's no external threat to Judea, taking these territories isn't without difficulty, however, and the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, including territorial expansion, comes to a head. So let's take a moment and learn how this impacts the Jews of Judea, including Jacob, the grandfather of Jesus, the coming Messiah. And so I've given you the sort of outline of the territories. Now we're going to give you a little bit of what actually happened. So early in Judea's 27-year expansion under Alexander Jannaeus, so he was ruling for 27 years, he started a fake friendship with Ptolemy IX, the son of Cleopatra the Queen, who I put up a moment ago. and she had given her support to Judea. Despite this friendship and contrary to the interest of Egypt, Alexander Jannaeus attempts to take control of Gaza, but he fails. So let's just come to this. So here's Gaza here. Obviously a very contentious issue today. What was the significance of Gaza in ancient times? Does anyone have any understanding of why it's significant? Because this comes between the Egyptians and the Judeans.
Trade route?
It's the trade route, spot on. So this point here, all of the trade that comes from Arabia and from inland to the east ends up being shipped from Gaza. So Gaza is a trading port, and it's also the junction between the north and the south, from Egypt going up to north and across to Europe inevitably through either the ships on the Mediterranean or by land as they go across the top of today's Turkey. So it was a prized place, and it actually had a lot to do with controlling trade and taxes. So despite this friendship and contrary to the interest of Egypt, Alexander Jannaeus attempts to take control of Gaza, which they didn't have control of at that time. But he fails. Astoundingly, he seeks the assistance of Cleopatra the boy's mother, because she had said that she would support him, without her son's knowledge. But when her son finds out, he attacks Judea in a rage and defeats Alexander Jannaeus in a battle at a place called Saphoth next to the Jordan River. And so he's not happy. So Ptolemy IX is not content with his victory. He actually overruns Judea altogether. So in one foul swoop, after all of these generations of gaining this land, this son with his army sweeps through the land. So how does he actually do it? It's actually explained by the Jewish historian Josephus, and he explains what happens in the villages he stays in at night in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews. So every time there's a battle or a skirmish, they stay in the land. But they want to scare people. What do you think they do? I think I gave it away earlier. What do they do to scare people? See, sometimes fear wins battles much more than the fighting itself.
Create a rumour.
My forefathers were Scottish. They used to play the bagpipes heading in, and people used to run in fear because they'd never heard such a noise before. And so this was part of their strategy for creating fear. So there's lots of armies create fear when they first go in. So let's see what Josephus has to say. He says, so keep in mind they're staying in villages at night. When night came on, he abode in certain villages of Judea, which when he found full of women and children, he commanded his soldiers to strangle them and to cut them in pieces and then cast them into boiling cauldrons and then devour their limbs as sacrifices. Can you imagine? So it doesn't matter how many people we're talking about here. If they did it to 10 people, and the next village is really scared. Can you imagine the effect? Can you imagine the stories screaming around the land that these people don't just kill people, but they cut them up and then they eat them as a sacrifice? So it reads on, this commandment was given that such as fled from the battle and came to them might suppose their enemies were cannibals and eat men's flesh, and might on that account be still more terrified at them upon such a sight. Well, it worked really well. They overran the land, but they didn't get to Jerusalem. So this is before they got to Jerusalem that all this was happening. So this cannibalism terrifies the mercenary army of Alexander Jannaeus, but as a defeated force, they can't stop Ptolemy IX until Cleopatra III, seeing how powerful her son has become, steps in and stops him. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. It's quite a long story what happens. But at the end of the day, she sends troops up by sea, and they come into the land from various locations. They also attack the Sadducees to the north, and they join forces with them, and they take the land back. See, his mother is worried about him getting too powerful. And so she sees her own son now as a threat, and so she sides with her alliance with Alexander Jannaeus, and she goes about her business and stops him. So very fortunate for the Judean people. So many battles are fought with the aid of Cleopatra III until Alexander Jannaeus regains control But the horrific slaughter and cannibalism flabbergasted Jews of Judea when they learned their leader took such a foolish risk to meddle in the relationship of two foreign rulers. So remember what happened. This all happened because of Gaza. He attacked Gaza and he didn't win. And so he tried to enlist the aid of Cleopatra III, and the son found out and goes into a rage. Why does he go into a rage? Because he wants it for himself. Because it's the key. It's the control of all the trading. And so he wanted it. So when his mother basically sided with his opposition, he got upset and went and sorted out the opposition. So this is the backbone of why this all happened. But from the people, so imagine you're Jacob and the other people living in the land. There's their ruler running around trying to take up more territory all the time aggressively, and he does something which is underhand, and as a consequence, his fellow brothers and sisters start getting cooked in pots and eaten. So what do you think they thought of their leader? They're not very happy with him because of what he actually did. So they're justifiably angry, and the Pharisees, and this is where we come back to this now, the Pharisees have always been clear in their position, and that's that they are against any further expansion of the Hasmonean Kingdom, and this event further exacerbates the rift they already have in their relationship with the king. Okay, so they see him as an even worse leader as a consequence. The Sadducees, however, remain loyal to Jannaeus, but their leader clearly establishes he is more interested in the conquest of territory than his obligations as the high priest of Judea. So remember, he's in a dual role as a leader, but he's never there. He's never doing any of his functions as a high priest. He's busy travelling and fighting all of the time. So less interested in his obligations as high priest, although Alexander Jannaeus is a Sadducee, he only adopts their ceremonial rites when he officiates at the temple of Jerusalem, which is not often, as I'm saying. So during the holiday of Sukkot in the same year, when many Pharisees and traditional Jews come to the temple, they believe in the importance of performing a water libation, which is a drink offering to God. So remember, when they go to the temple once a year, they make offerings to say thanks for God's provision at the end of the day. Water is obviously key to life. And so the Pharisees believe that they should make a water libation, which means they should pour water onto the altar of God, just as they burn grain and animals and so on. What do you think the Sadducees think about that? They don't agree. And of course, Alexander Jannaeus is the leader of the Sadducees, and he's the high priest. So what does he do? They're shocked when Alexander Jannaeus uses this occasion to demonstrate his support for the Sadducees by pouring the water on his feet rather than on the altar. The crowd respond to his mockery, and they pelt him with etrogim, or citrons, or etrons. And I'm going to put up I'm going to put up a picture. It's a lemon. Okay. These lemons are different to our normal lemons. They're actually quite large, and they've got a very thick skin that's on them. But citron or etrog, and so they're at the festival of Sukkot, and one of the things they have at the festival is they have a lemon in the palm of the hand, and they have a palm leaf which they wave around at various parts of the ceremony as well. So the crowd respond to his mockery, and they pelt him with these lemons that they hold in their hands. Now, you'll understand when I give you the number, there's thousands of people there. So you can imagine thousands of people suddenly start pitching these huge lemons the size of your hand at you, and the ruler's not very happy. So the crowd responded and said they pelt him with these. Upset and ignorant in their actions, the crowd actually plays right into his hands, as he knew this would incite them to a riot. So in other words, he poured the water on his feet intentionally because he knew the crowd would get upset. Why did he want to do this? He wants to get rid of opposition to him. So he commands his soldiers to fall upon them, and in excess of 6,000 Jews are slaughtered in the temple courtyard. So I don't know how many Jews were in the temple altogether, but there's more than 6,000 lemons being thrown at this guy. And so he's got really upset. So just to fill you in on this, I've got a note up here. The etrog is used in the waving rituals during the festival of Sukkot. The shape represents the heart of the ideal Jew who has both knowledge of the Torah and good deeds because it has both a pleasant scent and a pleasant taste. And so this is the meaning behind why they actually have these. Here in Australia, these get brought into the country during the Feast of Tabernacles. It's Sukkot, the same thing. Okay? They bring these things in. They come from all over the world. They're only grown in certain countries. And they can sometimes spend in excess of $100 to get one. Because they're very hard to get. Because they're in demand at that time of the year. And so this is what actually happens. This picture I was given permission for my book from a grocer, a Jewish grocer who's in New York in America. This is like the best, most clean picture I could find of an etrog.
Wow.
And he was telling me some of what actually happens at that time of year. Their business just goes crazy. And they make a fortune.
Oh.
Because these things are sent all over the world. They get put into individual boxes and wrapped up and the whole bit. So it's quite extraordinary. Okay, so this willful slaughter of his own people is extraordinary. As a common people with a common faith in God, celebrating a religious festival at God's temple, you would have to wonder how their high priest Alexander Jannaeus could break God's command, which is, "Thou shalt not kill," to massacre his own people. So how can the Jews believe in the holiness of their own priesthood if they murdered over a procedural disagreement between the Sadducees and the Pharisees? And so once again, this is what it boils back to. We've got a division between Sadducees and Pharisees. So now in the temple of Jerusalem, 6,000 people are slaughtered because water was poured out on his feet rather than an altar, and 6,000 plus lemons got pitched at the king. So it's part of their history you don't really hear about, but you can see why they were in disarray and how strong the differences were between them as two parties, two political parties with different religious ideologies. So based on the testimony of Luke in his New Testament Gospel, we're just going to make a note on Jacob at the moment. It says that Jacob's son Joseph lives in Nazareth. So we go to Luke chapter 2 verse 4. It reads Luke chapter 2 verse 4. It reads, Joseph went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to the town of Bethlehem in Judea, the birthplace of King David. Joseph went there because he was a descendant of David. So he was a descendant of David. He was living in Nazareth. Why did he have to go to Bethlehem? Does anyone remember the story in the Bible? It was because there was a census, right? So they were taking a census, and you had to actually go to where you were actually not just born, in fact, but where your inheritance is. Okay? So that's your connection. Your connection is right back to when they first went into the land, and Bethlehem was given to Solomon, the first descendant who came into the land. And so when a census happens, they have to go back to their inheritance, their home of inheritance. And so he travels back. But the fact that he's in Nazareth going back to Bethlehem, what does that say to us? And remember, through all of this, we're following the genealogy of Jesus. And so we've gone from King David through all the kings until the kings are no more. And the story is all about Jerusalem. When they come back, we find that Zerubbabel, as that descendant who arrives back as a leader, we find that he actually isn't in a census that was taken and a vote which was recorded in the Bible, which says who got to stay in Jerusalem and who had to go back to their villages. You might remember they drew lots, and 1 out of every 10 got to stay in Jerusalem and the other 9 out of 10 didn't. Zerubbabel was not amongst them, which means that the family went back to Bethlehem, their home of inheritance. From there we lose the story of the Bible for individual people, but we would assume that they remain where their home of inheritance is. It's where they earn their living. And so we go through all the descendants, and then we come to this time where we've got Joseph. We're looking at Jacob at the moment, but Joseph came from Nazareth. So what does that mean about Jacob? Jacob wasn't perhaps living in Bethlehem anymore, was he? So at some point in time, we don't know exactly, but probably during this time, there was some movement in the land. Why do you think I feel that it's during this time that they would actually move. What's actually happening in the land of Judea, despite all of this catastrophe and fighting and cannibalism? What's actually happening with the land itself? They're expanding their territories again. So in other words, up to the previous king, they didn't actually have control over Nazareth. Remember, they were the southern kingdom of Judah formerly. Okay, so they had the tribal areas of Benjamin, the absorbed area of Simeon inside the tribe of Judah. And so they're all to the south, so no one's past the top of the Dead Sea, in other words. So suddenly we find out he's in Nazareth. The first time that they actually gain land to be in the north is actually under the previous king John Hyrcanus, and then Alexander Jannaeus runs around following up. And so we find here suddenly that people are now living in new places. It was probably work. They were building fortresses. They were building structures, synagogues, homes, whatever it was, as they spread, like you normally do in any place. And so it was either during the life of Joseph himself, or more probably his father, because it's when the land was expanded. He may have got one of those house and land packages like we get nowadays. Got a good deal. I'll go up and I'll build. and so we find some connection now with what's starting to happen with the New Testament. So the slaughter of 6,000 Jews in the temple courtyard of Jerusalem tells us clearly that Jacob was not there when the citrons were thrown at Alexander Jannaeus. Why? Because he survived to have a son called Joseph. The earliest reference to where Joseph, the son of Jacob, lives, as I said, is found in the Gospel according to Luke, and it's when he says Joseph went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee. So for a census, because as a descendant of King David, he had to return to his home, his place of family inheritance. This means at some point in time either Jacob and his family travelled north to Nazareth in the Galilee from Bethlehem in the south of Judea. So during a time of relative peace, the conquest of John Hyrcanus and his son Alexander Jannaeus rapidly expanded the territories of Judea, and with the Galilee firmly in the control of the Hasmonean Kingdom, it is reasonable to assume that Jacob has moved away from Bethlehem, perhaps, as I said, in the pursuit of work. Okay, so there are some severe repercussions for the slaughter of all of these innocent Jews during the Feast of Tabernacles. For after their country is overrun by the Egyptian army of Ptolemy IX and the Jewish villages are cannibalised, a riot in the temple leads to a civil war, and the civil war, Teresa, is called?
The Judean Civil War.
Civil War. Teresa's been doing some study about this, I'm very pleased to say, so well done. Okay, so this riot is actually supported by evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They tell of an opponent of Jannaeus who seeks popular support to overthrow the king, which is kind of expected in this situation. The author calls for an end to the dispute between Jannaeus and the Pharisees, and the only acceptable solution is an end to the Hasmonean priesthood and secular control. This opposition and the riot in the temple leads to a brief civil war known as the Judean Civil War. So through all of this, the thread that we keep hearing is that the issue between two political parties, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, are causing more problems in the land than what was happening outside. They finally got their territory, and as soon as they did, they start deciding what their identity is. I believe this, I believe that, and suddenly they're at each other's throats. And they're not just at each other's throats, but thousands of them are actually dying for it. Strange, isn't it? One God, and yet they're killing one another. Same laws, and yet they're killing one another. So the Judean Civil War initially begins after the conquest of Gaza by Jannaeus in 96 BC, but as it runs its course, Obodas I, who's a neighbouring Nabatean king, upset at the loss of Gaza because he used to control this before, and his control over the trade routes to Rome and Damascus, launches an attack on Judea in the Golan Heights in 93 BC. To exact revenge, he defeats the Hasmonean army and ambushes Alexander Jannaeus near a place called Gadara, just east of the Sea of Galilee, but the Judean king manages to escape. So I'll just pop up our map here. And so this is Gadara up here. The Nabateans, of course, are down here off the bottom, the Dead Sea on the eastern side in Jordan today. They came up, they would have come up the King's Highway, and they entered into the territory up here in the Golan Heights to fight. They fought this fight and they actually win the battle, and Alexander Jannaeus is fleeing on his way back to the capital. And the story, I haven't put it all in because it's a long story, but he basically falls off a high precipice. There's camels involved and he rolls down the bottom, and he's lucky to survive apparently. But he does survive and he gets away from them. But it's obviously a big wake-up call for him that if he's going to go out and take something, the other people aren't going to be very happy about it. So he's already had a huge battle with the Egyptians, and now he's having this battle with the Nabateans. So foreign nations constantly fight, and this is the regional look, for control over the East Mediterranean. Those from the north meet with those from the south in the region where Judea is in the middle. They're framed by the Mediterranean Sea on one side, and they've got the Jordan River and the Dead Sea on the other side. So they're between two bodies of water, so it's a very distinct territory. The region is filled with rich trading cities along the edge of the Mediterranean, such as Gaza, that earns great wealth from sea trade between Asia and the surrounding Mediterranean countries, and land trade between Africa and Asia. So it's going east to west and north to south. Battles over Gaza between Egypt, Nabatea and Judea are all related to trade, because whoever controls Gaza controls the flow of trade. When Alexander Jannaeus successfully won the conquest for Gaza, he gained the benefit of charging taxes for traded goods and taxes for providing safe passage for traders from bandits through an expanded Judea. Simply put, the safer the trade route, the more the traders use it. The more the traders use it, the more dineros they get, more money. And so it gave him a power and a wealth. So despite the gain of Gaza, this loss inflicted by the Nabateans is seen as the last straw against their warmongering king and an incompetent high priest. That's how the people of Judea see their king now. When Alexander Jannaeus returns to Jerusalem, the civil strife has not abated, and a fierce opposition waits for him. Civil war erupts again between Pharisee-supported rebels and Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus succeeds early in the war, but the rebels are so determined to see his demise, they unbelievably ask for help from their former enemy, the Sadducees. So that's the kings of the north. So this next slide is a picture of a fellow called Demetrius Iii Eukarius. And so this fellow here is the ruler of the Sadducees at this point in time. So this king agrees to help, and Jewish insurgents join with his army to fight and defeat Alexander Jannaeus at Shechem. Alexander Jannaeus is forced into exile in the mountains, but no sooner than it took to win this victory do the Jewish rebels weigh up their future and decide it's still better to live under the rule of a terrible Jewish king rather than go back to the times of being under the Seleucid ruler. So what happens is 6,000 of the Jews, they return to the side of Alexander Jannaeus, and Demetrius III is actually defeated. The civil war ran its course for 6 years. Again, it's not the main focus of our lesson, so I'm just giving you the surface details. It ran for 6 years, during which 50,000 Jews lost their lives. So huge numbers. It's a civil war, remember. So if you start adding the ones in the temple and these people and the one who are being cannibalised, in a short period of time, we're heading towards 70, 80,000 people being killed by their own. And a surge of national solidarity against Seleucid influence is a benefit to Alexander Jannaeus. But as a leader, he still refuses to reconcile with the issues at hand. Popular unrest, poverty and grief sets in until in 88 BC, the greatest shock occurs when Alexander Jannaeus brings 800 rebel Pharisees to Jerusalem to crucify in revenge. 800 Pharisees to crucify them in revenge. And so you can imagine living in the land at this point in time. People would be running scared. I mean, these are basically two political parties with two different religious ideologies. We did go through them in the previous lesson, but the religious ideologies don't sort of see them murdering each other, for goodness sake. But this is actually what starts to happen. So also recorded in a Dead Sea Scroll called the Pesher Nahum, Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, and I quote, "As he was feasting with his concubines, he, meaning Alexander Jannaeus, in the sight of all the city, he ordered about 800 of them to be crucified. And while they were living, he ordered the throats of their children and wives to be cut before their eyes." And so you can imagine this scene. 800 Pharisees, crowds watching, kings probably dining at the same time, and he parades their children and the wives in front of these Pharisees who are already nailed to the cross but not dead, and then slits all of their throats. This is politics in Judea at the time between two political, theological parties. It's extraordinary. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. We're talking about crucifixion obviously at the moment, a bit of a topic obviously for Christian people because Jesus was crucified on the cross. For most people, crucifixion is probably the first time they understand it to happen is when Jesus was crucified on the cross during the time of the Romans. People thought that it was a Roman thing, but it's not. Far from it. The first record of crucifixion actually occurs in 519 BC when Darius I, the king of Persia, crucified 3,000 political opponents in Babylon. That's the first historical record. I assume there's probably others that happen that aren't recorded. The first time it's forced on the Jews of Judea is when Antiochus IV Epiphanes crucifies those who won't accept Hellenization. So we had a look at that not long ago, when he came in with the abomination of desolation and put the Greek god Zeus in the temple. Those who were rebelling, he was crucifying them. You might remember when he came back from Egypt, he wasn't happy either, and he killed 80,000 Jews at that point in time. And so here we find this is the second instance, but this is the first time it's forced on the Jews. And the first time a Jew is recorded crucifying another is when Alexander Jannaeus crucifies these 800 Pharisees, intent on providing a slow, excruciatingly painful and humiliating death to dissuade others from rebelling. Now, does everyone ever use that word excruciate or excruciatingly painful? Anyone know what it actually means when we use this word excruciating?
Extremely
Intense. Crucified.
intense.
Crucified.
Think about the word. That's right. C-R-U-C. It's right in the middle of the word. So the word excruciate means out of crucifying. So it's the pain that you experience if you were crucified. So when you say someone's suffering from an excruciating pain, they're saying and likening it to somebody who's being crucified on a cross. And we know if you look at the science behind that, there's plenty of information on that, it's extraordinarily painful. And so there's a use of word in the common English language, which people probably don't realise that it's actually stemmed from the word crucify. So the traditional Jewish way to execute is by stoning, if you read the Bible and the laws of God. So when Alexander Jannaeus crucifies the Pharisees, it is actually considered an anathema, which is an abomination, which is the same as the abomination of desolation in the temple, and he earns himself the reputation of a tyrant. So you can imagine, by this stage, people have been boiled and eaten, they've been slaughtered, they've been killed in the temple, and now we find that they're being crucified. And so he's now seen as a tyrant. Whilst there's no evidence for crucifixion by Jews prior to Alexander Jannaeus, however, Deuteronomy chapter 21 verses 22 to 23 reveals a law handed down by Moses in which details are given to manage a crucified body so the land where a person is put to death is not defiled. So what does this tell you about crucifixion? And so here's the scripture. It says, if someone has been put to death for a crime and the body is hung on a post, they call this hanging on a post, It must not remain there overnight. It must be buried the same day, because a dead body hanging on a post brings God's curse on the land. Bury the body so you will not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So this is how they crucified back then. There was no crossbar. This law, does everyone see what it's saying in relation to Jesus and the story of Jesus?
He got taken down before.
He had to be taken down before dusk. Otherwise, Jesus, who came to bless all people from all nations, would have in fact cursed. And so the same laws that applied back in the time when they were first given to Moses were actually part of the story of Jesus on the day that he was crucified. And so they were actually fulfilling a Jewish law, which was formerly an Israelite law, which is a Hebrew law, whichever you want to talk about what era. But the fact is, it's been going on since the time of Moses. And these laws were already put into place. If God gave these laws, does it not make you think about the fact that he knew what was going to happen when Jesus arrived here? He predetermined what had to be done from the first instance. It's quite extraordinary. And so this journey of crucifixion, there is other examples in the Bible, in the Old Testament, but Jews against Jews, this is the first time. But I would suggest to you, since this is in the laws of Moses, that this has been going on from a very, very long time. So it's quite horrible to think about. Okay, so clearly Alexander Jannaeus has gone too far. He continues to rule until he suffers from a bout of fever and hard drinking during a siege of a fortress called Gaza to the east of the Jordan River. His queen, Salome Alexandra, worries because the nation of Judea is against her and her sons because of his actions. So she travels to Gaza to see her husband on his deathbed. The dying king advises his weeping and mournful wife he is entrusting her to govern Judea. Interesting, isn't it? He's now saying the same thing to his wife that the former king, John Hyrcanus, had said to his wife, who was put into prison and starved to death. And so this man was the son of the former queen, and she was in prison with the mother, who was actually starved to death. And so here he is now on his deathbed, and he's now actually giving exactly the same command that his father gave. Extraordinary, isn't it? See how life damages people. So the dying king advises his weeping, and so repeat, his weeping and mournful wife, he's entrusting her to govern Judea, but she must seek reconciliation with the Pharisees if they are to retain the kingdom for their children. So in other words, he knows that the game is up. If they carry on the way they're going, there is no way they're going to retain the kingdom. And so he advises her that she needs to make these changes. So in other words, the Pharisees are going to come on the rise and the Sadducees are going to be on the nose. And so we see a complete switch in the politics of the country as a result of his actions. So the very person who caused this is actually going to be the person who causes the change towards the Pharisees. So confident of both his death and success in battle at Gaza, Alexander Jannaeus instructs Salome to return triumphantly to Jerusalem with his body and acknowledge his people have suffered under his rule. So I'll just put this up behind me. They're just schematic diagrams of Salome Alexandra, and she has a son called Hyrcanus II, who we're going to come to in a moment. So again, he then asks her to he asks her to take his body back to Jerusalem and acknowledge the people have suffered under his rule. So in other words, he knows he's going to die. He then asks her to send for the leading representatives of the Pharisees, amongst whom is her own brother, the chief, Shimon ben Shattach. So we find out that the chief Pharisee is actually the brother of Salome Alexandra, who is married to the worst Sadducee in history, who's murdered the Pharisees. Extraordinary, isn't it? So where do you think her brother's been all this time? They've been hiding. I suggest they've been hiding. So she's to show them his body and give them permission to do with it as they please, even if it means they refuse to bury it or damage it in some way. By doing this, Alexander Jannaeus understands his wife will demonstrate she knows her husband is at fault. Finally, Alexander Jannaeus instructs Salome to promise the Pharisees she will not act on any affairs of state without their agreement. He knows he has not acted in the best interest of his people, but he understands if his wife submits to the Pharisees, they won't dishonour his body and they won't stop her from ruling in safety. So he dies in 76 BC, and Salome does exactly what he says. She returns to Jerusalem with his body, and upon her return, Salome is successful by the criteria that her husband set out. She finds the leaders of the Pharisees who had hid due to the persecution of her husband. So they were in hiding, many of them. Assuring them of her future policies, they act just as Alexander Jannaeus said they will, and give his remains the funeral rites of a king. He is honoured with a grand funeral, and Salome subsequently becomes the only Jewish queen to rule. By obtaining the support of the Pharisees, she avoids any public affront because of her dead husband and assures the Hasmonean dynasty survives. And so we see his passing, and we see a reconciliation with the Pharisees, and we see her in a position of power as a female queen for the first time. The Pharisees have suffered miserably under Alexander Jannaeus, but the recent change in circumstances mean they are now not only tolerated by the community, but become the new ruling class. Salome installs her eldest son Hyrcanus II as the new high priest and has the full support of the Pharisees, and the Sanhedrin is reorganised according to their wishes. So the rule of the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin is over as well. You have to think about the implications of this, because that means that the Pharisees will implement the oral Torah, for example, whereas the Sadducees didn't. The Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection, for example. We spoke about a whole range of things. There was differences between them. So all these things now come into the house, so to speak. So under the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin was like a house of lords, whose members belonged to the highest rabbinical court. But with new changes guided by the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin becomes more like a supreme court for the administration of justice and matters of religion. With their power removed, the Sadducees petition the queen for protection from the Pharisees, but with all the problems suffered because of religious difference, she decides to avoid any further conflict, and she moves the Sadducees away from Jerusalem altogether and gives them various fortified towns as their new places of residence. So, from one ruler to the next, we've gone from Sadducees being in power, the slaughter of many Jews, the overthrow basically of the Sadducees, and now we find them kicked out of Jerusalem, and the Pharisees are now in power and running the show, in alignment with the queen, as it turns out. And so we see a significant shift. So this is the life that Joseph is being born into. Okay, so we're setting the scene, we're really very much painting the picture for when Jesus comes. All of this politics has been happening before then, and you can see it's in disarray. And why? Because we have religious people with different ideologies who are practicing their faith in different ways, to the extent that they're prepared to murder one another. Wow, amazing, isn't it? And so this is the time when Jesus is to come. So Salome increases the size of her army and carefully provisions numerous places of fortification, so that neighbouring kingdoms are impressed by the quantity of protected towns and castles bordering the Judean frontier. You can imagine when a new king takes over, everybody wants to have a go, but in this case a new queen has taken over, and there'd been an assumption by all the male kings of the nations around them that they would make them weak. And so what does she do? She goes about fortifying and putting on a show to make sure everybody leaves them alone. She engages in warfare and sends her younger son Aristobulus II north with an army to besiege Damascus. Unfortunately, it's not successful, so they don't grow any territory in that direction. The last days of her reign are tumultuous because her son Aristobulus attempts to seize government. You have to remember, she's been around for a fair time now, so she's fairly elderly. So obviously she's probably got a heart to put things in place in preparation for the next generation. So one son's given the authority to rule, so what's the other son doing? He wants to topple him over. And so we see this conflict. It seems to happen in every generation. So Alexandria dies in 67 BC, and names Hyrcanus II, who is already high priest and sympathetic to the Pharisees, as her successor to the throne. But here's where the difference happens. He doesn't retain the role of high priest. He gives that up, and the priesthood is separated from the ruling party, finally. So I've estimated in the same year as 67 BC that Jacob dies under what is the last independent ruler of the Hasmonean Kingdom in Judea. So in his life, he's the only descendant from the line of David since Babylonian captivity who has lived a life wholly under the rule of an independent Judea. He has witnessed the succession of 4 Jewish rulers, and he is probably the first of his forefathers to move north of Jerusalem to live in the town of Nazareth in the region of the Galilee when the territory of Judea is expanded. He lives through a time when rival political parties seek to mould the nation of Judea into their ideologies, and he is no doubt horrified to hear his own leader resorts to revenge against his own people when he horrifically crucifies 800 Pharisees and murders their wives and children. After the death of Alexander Jannaeus, the peace restored by Salome Alexander is very welcome, and the change from the elitist Sadducees to the Pharisees in the administration of government and religious duties is in alignment with the common people of Judea. So in other words, Joseph enters into a time which is much better for the common people than the time of his father Jacob. In his latter years, Jacob witnesses the theology of the Sadducees being replaced by the practices of the Pharisees, led by their chief Shimon ben Shettach, who becomes known as the restorer of the law. So that's the brother of Salome. He gets this title as restorer of the law. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Sadducees said that the only law was the Torah. But clearly with what was going on, they weren't practicing the law very well. But when the Pharisees come in, they bring in the oral Torah as well. So when they talk about restoring the law, they're not just talking about restoring what the Torah has, the first 5 books of the Bible, but they're in fact talking about the oral Torah as well. So like all his forefathers, Jacob is responsible for the religious instruction and teaching of the law to his son Joseph, who will become the legal father of Jesus. Although it is too late to be of any personal concern to Jacob, schools are opened for the first time in the largest cities of Judea by the chief Pharisee Shimon, but not in the small villages or towns of Bethlehem or Nazareth. So we see a restructuring of society, and schools for the first time are brought into Judea during the time of Joseph. Okay, so this is a significant thing, because up until then it was only the parents who were responsible for teaching the children. Now they're going to be sent off to school in the bigger centres. So it is in this time and in these circumstances that Joseph will grow up in Nazareth. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the story of Jacob, and so in our next lesson we finally move into the time of Joseph, and as you can understand, that means that we're going to be getting in the New Testament finally, and we're going to be hearing a bit more history, but we're also going to start having the outcomes of that journey of his, because he has a son, of course, and he marries a young lady called Mary, and he has a son called Jesus. And so Joseph's story is not independent of Jesus. Joseph's story is obviously part of the story of Jesus as well. And so as we go through the next descendant, we're going to be exploring the circumstances right before the birth of Jesus, and then we're going to start looking at what's going on in the lives of Joseph and their family.